Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Young Leaders Circle eventcast at the Manhattan Institute. My name is Vanessa Mendoza, and I am your host for this program. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Young Leaders Circle, Jonah Goldberg. Jonah holds the Asness Chair for Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute, our friends over in DC. He is a fellow at the National Review Institute. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the online opinion and news publication, The Dispatch, which I highly recommend to all of you. He's an author, most recently Suicide of the West, which was published in 2018 and is a New York Times bestseller. Jonah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Huge fan of the Manhattan Institute.
Well, thanks. You and I were supposed to have this interview 3 months ago in New York City. And in fact, I think it was the day that New York City shut down. And the prompt for our interview was the future of the conservative movement. Now, that question is still very important today, although we look at it not just through the lens of the Trump presidency, but in the midst of a global pandemic, enormous unrest across the country, particularly in our urban centers, and a rapidly approaching presidential election. I know for myself, and I imagine for many of our viewers, we want to get to a better future, better place than we are today, and talking about how the conservative movement can help us get there. It's an important question. So let me start with the big one. When President Trump was elected, the big question, certainly in sort of intellectual circles, but broader than that, was whether or not it represented a fundamental change in modern American conservatism. Whether the traditionalist and libertarian impulses, whether they still have their hold as the foundation of modern American conservatism. So let's start there. It's a big question, but where are we today, Jonah? How do you look at this?
Sure. I think it's worth just pointing out very quickly that Donald Trump basically had two mandates in 2016. One was to not be Hillary Clinton, and the other one was to appoint conservative judges and then do something about immigration. So three, right? But the most important one really there is to not be Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are the first two presidential candidates of major parties that were unpopular with the majority of American voters. It was a weird situation, and so since it was so narrow, Trump lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College with this with basically 78,000 votes in 3 states. It is possible to attribute. You can't pick one reason why he won. And so everybody gets to argue their book. They get to argue their priors about what the Trump presidency really meant, and it's really not falsifiable. That said, going forward, I think that Trump has had a pretty dramatic effect on conservatism. And I think in many ways, Trump is not the creator of our problems. The worst parts of his presidency and his candidacy were symptoms of problems that have been on the books for a very long time. But there has been a sort of unraveling of what used to be considered the conservative fusionist consensus of this mix of conservatism and libertarianism that basically dominated, at least on intellectual circles, for a very long time. That's over. The nationalism, I don't say over, but it's not what it once was. And this groping search for nationalism, or what is it? Rubio calls it common good capitalism. The guys over at First Things call it post-liberal Catholic integralism, right? It is all these different groups groping at this idea that there's something better than the sort of classical liberal understanding of the role of the state married to a conservative understanding of what makes for good character, what makes for a healthy society, which used to sort of define in broad brushstrokes fusionism. That has taken an enormous hit. And so I actually don't know what the future is. As someone who actually believes in the sort of in that fusionist vision, the classical liberal vision, I worry about it, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about it. But you have very serious people like Senator Hawley and Senator Rubio, and also a lot of clowns who basically want to come up with some sort of post-conservative conservatism, as it were, a new right, and they haven't managed to gel around a single set of ideas, in part because Donald Trump can't stay on a clear ideological agenda. And so if you actually try to stick to your own clear ideological agenda, at some point, you're going to end up butting into what Trump actually does, because he does not actually have one of these visions for what America should look like. And that's a real problem for intellectuals who hitch their wagon to him.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, I think it's incumbent on us to point out that the relationship that existed between social conservatives and libertarians, a lot of that is forged out of having a common enemy, right? I mean, yep. Emerging out of the Cold War. Can that relationship, one that you'd like to see continue into the future, can it exist without an enemy? I mean, is the rise of socialism in the United States enough, or is it not necessary to begin with?
Well, I mean, it's true that this is true of almost all political movements, is that some significant chunk of them is defined by what they're against rather than what they're for. That's always part of politics. And it is true that the Cold War provided this sort of perfect galvanizing force that locked in the three legs of the sort of Reaganite stool. It is possible that China will provide some of that. Donald Trump, during his presidency, has tried to make it about sort of inchoate domestic enemy, fake news, deep state, and all of that. I don't think that that's as effective. But, you know, I'm one of these people who actually believes that a lot of our problems today are a symptom of a lot of the reasons for our partisan polarization and the intensity of our partisanship in this country have to do with the fact that the parties are too weak, not that they're too strong. And they don't do a good enough job of policing their own agenda setting. Yeah. And a lot of that stuff has basically been farmed out to mainstream media, right-wing media, ideological media on the left, all that kind of stuff, and also to interest groups. Whatever you want to say about the agenda of Planned Parenthood or the NRA, both of those groups do more in terms of voter information, voter organization, issue opposition research, all of that kind of stuff than the actual parties do.
Right.
And that's a huge part of the problem. And so one of the things I think is sort of incumbent upon think tanks like the Manhattan Institute, AEI, a few others, is to understand that they're not actually part of the real party system, that they're supposed to be playing a long game that is not just about the next election, but is about the sort of, you know, a serious policy agenda about what will actually help human beings in the long run, not just, you know, providing talking points to, you know, drink liberal tears and all of that kind of stuff. There are other places to do that kind of thing.
Let's talk about the helping human beings piece of this, because, you know, many people, particularly folks in the movement, were shocked when the president got elected. I mean, frankly, we hear from many people the president was shocked, right? But we learned something in that moment that had unfortunately not been recognized, at least not strongly enough in the movement, about how various groups of Americans feel about the country and what state of being they have in terms of their occupation, in terms of their quality of life. So, you know, these additional forces, whether they're nationalist or populist, that are gaining interest over time, they're responding to something that's really real. So how do you respond with your view of the world? How do you think about that? Now we've seen it, we know it. There's enough data existing to show us that this is not emotional, this is real. We can see where jobs have gone. So we have to adapt, at least, I mean, I think we have to adapt at least somewhat to that reality and address that. So how do you think about that through your vision of the movement?
Sure. So a couple different things. First of all, how many really important decisions in your life have you made when you're really, really angry? You know, there is a problem with, you know, the formulation of a lot of this. They say people are really angry, and so therefore we have to do what they want to do. And we hear this from the left about the protesters. We hear this about the right, about the populists and all of that. And, you know, I'm such a small C conservative. I'm generally against political enthusiasm of any kind. But, you know, one of my great frustrations is that, you know, the people like J.D. Vance and Senator Hawley and Reihan Salam, they have legitimate points about how government and elites took their eyes off the ball on a bunch of different issues. I think that's right. One of my great frustrations is that there were a bunch of people. Reihan was one of them. Ramesh Ponnuru, Yuval Levin, Michael Strain at AI. You can go down a list. Call them reformicons, call them whatever you want. Ross Douthat, who are very much interested in actually helping the people that are very, very angry that helped Donald Trump get elected back before their problems got so bad. And there was a group of sort of conservative sort of gatekeepers who kept insisting, no, unadulterated Ronald Reagan circa 1982 is what conservatism is, and we cannot change that. And so they were all, they were called squishes, they were called, rhinos and all this kind of stuff. And fast forward to 2015, 2016, all of a sudden, the same people who were saying you're rhinos and you're squishes are saying, don't you know that these blue collar workers are suffering? Don't you know that they need help? And those were the very people who shouted down people like, Reihan and Yuval and all these people who actually had serious policy proposals that came out of places like Manhattan Institute and the American Enterprise Institute to actually deal with the problem. And so there's a real frustration that there's so much sort of performative populist stuff that came late in the process, that if people just had opened their ears a little bit to the idea that maybe we should apply Reaganite principles to new problems in ways that don't conform with the 1982 tax cutting program, we would have been in a better place, and you wouldn't have people so desperate to sort of do this Hail Mary pass on Trumpism. Well,
so with all that being the case, then there's a sort of ready policy agenda for people who have now woken up as the result of the election that in your mind they should be activating? Because it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like that's happening.
Yeah, well, you sort of have to take it piecemeal. There are things like, again, and also the COVID thing kind of the COVID and the ensuing economic catastrophe, and also now the social unrest thing. You kind of have to wait for the smoke to clear to see what policies still make sense. You can't just grab whatever's off the shelf that may have made sense 2 years ago or 5 years ago that may not now, given the scope of our problems. But, there are things like figuring out ways so that people aren't stuck in the social safety nets in local communities. There are lots of people who would love to move to where the jobs are, but if they move to where the jobs are, they lose all of the benefits that they need, and some of them truly need them for health reasons, for sick kids, and all of the rest. My colleague at AEI, Michael Strain, he talks about maybe figuring out ways to subsidize people moving to where the jobs are. There's all sorts of things to be done and you guys at Manhattan know this better than I, to be done about reforming cities. Historically, cities are where poor people go to find jobs, and with the way zoning works, the way the sky high rents and all of these sorts of and rent control, you basically lock people out at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder from being able to get on that ladder. Mm-hmm. And figuring out ways to reform that, I think, is hugely important. I'm going to sort of trigger Reihan by talking about how more people should study the way Houston does zoning. So you can pick things piecemeal and figure out you do what you can where you can. As a conservative, one of the things I don't like about things like nationalism or socialism, which I think are very similar things historically, is sort of one size fits all. Let's have radical transformation of the system. I'm much more of a Burkean. or a Disraelian. I want to muddle through. You fix the things that are in need of fixing right now without radically tearing down the entire system, because at the end of the day, the system is more good than bad.
So, I want to get back to a point you made just a minute ago about the gatekeepers. And so this is a question about the office of the presidency, not Donald Trump per se, although you could use him as an example if you'd like, whether or not the person who's in office, which seems obvious, or who seems most likely to be elected, that they now are sort of wagging the party around as opposed to the other way around, right? And so a colleague and I were talking yesterday about this interview, and he reminded me that the Republican Party really went to the mat for President Bush about the Iraq War. And when Donald Trump basically called him a war criminal, they were silent for the most part, indicating that there was a different, a different outlook. How can we think about the future of the movement if the party itself appears to be just following after who's most electable in that moment, as opposed to holding on to whatever principles they've determined in that moment are appropriate? And then what does that mean for the intellectual movement that's just outside of that in terms of its relationship with the politics?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I could go a bunch of different places with it. I think, first of all, one of my big peeves is to the extent to which how so many conservatives in journalism and broadcast and all that kind of stuff, and also in the sort of eggheadosphere, have sometimes unwittingly and sort of subconsciously internalized the idea that to be a conservative intellectual is to be some kind of Republican Party consultant. And that was not the point of the conservative movement that began, at least the modern one that began with Buckley and all the rest. It was the whole point of the conservative movement, however you want to define it, was not to move the Republican Party rightward, but to move the center of gravity of American politics rightward. And that's kind of been lost in all of this. If you move it's great to have the Republican Party move rightward if it brings the country with it. If it doesn't do that, long term, you're creating more problems for conservatism than benefits. And so that's a big part of the problem. I think one of the ways one of the things that I think a lot of conservatives who are in this business writ large need to do is, ask themselves, is what you're doing simply for the benefit of a party, or is it actually benefit of the country or the cause? And just doing that sort of personal inventory, I think, would be hugely important. But one of the things I failed to appreciate, I've been in Washington for 25, 30 years. When I came to National Review, one of the things we're all taught is this phrase from William Rusher, the longtime publisher of National Review, is that politicians will always disappoint you. Mm-hmm. And the point was that not necessarily politicians are bad people, some are, but it's that their incentive structure is just simply different for some wonky kid whose dream is to write at National Review or be a scholar at MI or AEI or something like that. They have to answer to voters. They want to get reelected. What I think has changed our politics so much, and this is a Republican and Democratic point, is that the incentive structure is no longer about winning the general election. It's about winning your primary. And the power of incumbency has gotten to the point that if you win your primary, you're almost guaranteed to hold on to your seat. And so the incentive structure for politicians has changed. It used to be politicians ran to their party base in the primary, and then to win the general election, they had to moderate to pull in the independents, the moderates, and all that kind of stuff. That's not the dynamic in a lot of places anymore. And so what you end up having is you have politicians basically doing whatever they can just to avoid being primaried, which is really Donald Trump's major power over the Republican Party, is they can kill anybody in a primary. And so his superpower is really only effective against Republicans, not against Democrats. And so the problem that you now have is that the Republican Party basically isn't a party in any respect. We're the first, and I rant about this on my podcast all the time, but we're the first and really the only, with the possible exception of England, major industrialized democracy in the world whose parties have completely abdicated the responsibility of picking their own candidates. Instead, we leave it up to this democratized process of primaries. And I think that's a real problem. And it has cascading effects on how our politics work. If all you have to do is pander through Fox News or MSNBC or talk radio to the 15% of the party that you're sure is going to be mobilized and show up for a primary that is going to win it for you, then your incentive structure to get anything constructive done goes out the window, unless it's just pure symbolic culture war, fan service politics for your base that actually don't change a lot of people's lives.
So I want to ask you about how that works on the left, because it feels a little different. Before we jump into that question, I want to let all our viewers know that you are free to start typing in questions anytime you'd like. Jonah and I are going to talk for a little bit longer, but take a look. It's either on the right-hand side or right below the screen you're looking at. There will be a little Q&A box, and you can feel free to type in any questions for Jonah in that box. And when we conclude our interview, I'll go to those questions and we'll get Jonah to go through as many as possible. Okay, so back, Jonah, to this question of the left. So just comparing the right and the left in this regard, am I wrong in feeling like the left, its party and its intellectual movement seem to have a little bit of a stronger hold than it does on the right? I mean, I'm just thinking, certainly you have to take in consideration the rise of Bernie Sanders, but when you look at Biden and how he talks about the things he wants to do, I mean, he's very much like, don't look at what I've done or what I've believed in the past, but here's my playbook. And it seems to be handed to him like directly from the Center for American Progress. So yeah. Am I wrong about that in thinking that the left seems to have, for better or for worse, to manage this problem differently?
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. There's asymmetry between the two sides. The left, broadly defined, right, controls the commanding heights of the mainstream culture. Academia, mass entertainment, Hollywood, mainstream media, most of the big foundations, all of that kind of stuff. So they don't have the same relationship. They're not as outsidery to the culture as conservatives have historically been. And one of the great ironies is if you pay attention to this, there's this weird sort of left-wing envy of the right that plays itself out over and over again over the last 50, 60 years. The left chases all the conservatives, I'm exaggerating, but chases all the conservatives out of academia, so a bunch of them start think tanks. The think tanks are then very successful, so the left says, oh, we got to have think tanks. The mainstream media chases conservatives out and they do it to talk radio, and then all of a sudden the left says, oh my gosh, look how effective talk radio is. We got to have talk radio, which was that horrible Air America garbage. Same thing with Fox News. There is this like, oh, the right has all of these advantages. And one of the funny things about that is that they think it's the institutions rather than the arguments, right? It's like the idea that somehow having AM radio was better than having FM radio, NPR, the New York Times, MSNBC. Regardless, I think that, it's difficult to extrapolate grand theoretical constructs about this election cycle because basically Donald Trump is to Democrats now what Hillary Clinton was to Republicans in 2016. A sort of the Democrats are just going to be voting against Trump, not necessarily for Biden. Biden's job is to not be Donald Trump. And the fact that, this is one of the things I think is hilarious is you get every now and then these Yahoo types who are saying that the Wuhan virus and the pandemic were just a hoax created by the Democrats to ruin all of President Trump's economic successes. I was like, well, wait a second, let me get this straight. So the Democrats unleashed this thing in China and then in Western Europe, and they have no fingerprint, and then in the United States, they have no fingerprints on it. They completely pulled off this hoax, and yet the best candidate they can nominate for president is Joe Biden. It's more complicated than all of that. And Joe Biden is a bad candidate. His relationship to ideas is weak, but the Democratic Party and the left right now, I think, again, putting aside the social unrest stuff that's happening right now, is primarily just focused on getting rid of Trump. And my assumption is they will eat Joe Biden alive if he wins. It'll be kind of like LBJ. The party will tear itself apart trying to figure out what it actually stands for once he gets in there. But that's the dynamic that I think is going on right now.
So let me pull out a little bit broader for just a minute. Let's think of if we can think of the conservative movement as something cohesive for a minute. Talk to me about how it survives this COVID crisis. And here's, I think, specifically what I mean. For many of us, and certainly many of our viewers who believe in limited government, there were things we had to do in this moment. We believe there were things we had to do in this moment that would not normally be palatable, right? That don't match our principles. We felt we needed to do them. Many of them were done for better or for worse. But how do you recover from that? Because we've told the American public through these actions that that the federal government will always come in to save them. Remember, it's not just this time. We've done this before. And it sort of feels like that, Pandora's box, or how do you put that genie back in the bottle? Because we've been saying, hey, it's not possible, number one, to do it, and we shouldn't do it. It's not good for you. And in this moment, we're kind of saying, well, we can do it, and we kind of think it's good for you. How do you, outside of that emergency, pull that back? How do you argue it persuasively so that people understand why limited government is so important and how impossible the things that AOC and other politicians are proposing are impossible?
I'm a little more optimistic about this than a lot of people are on the right, for a couple of reasons. First of all, just at the theoretical level, there is nothing in classical liberalism. There is nothing in conservatism. There's nothing in libertarianism. Well, if you take out, anarcho-capitalism, there's nothing in mainstream right of center thinking that says there isn't a role for the government during a pandemic. It's just not there. George Washington mandated vaccinations. It's as my friend Charlie Cook likes to say, look, we've been saying for years, there are certain limited things that the government is there to do. Fight our wars, print money, cope with things like a pandemic. Well, this is a pandemic. And so even the minarchist, which is the night watchman state notion of the government that only is there to protect us, includes provisions for this kind of thing. So one of the reasons why I'm optimistic is that I don't think there's as much moral hazard here. The bailouts in 2008 are worse in that sense, because the government ran in to cover for actual people's mistakes and bad actions. Nobody in the United States of America is to blame for this pandemic. And so I think there are a lot of Americans who understand that this was an exception to the norm. And what the government was trying to do was minimize the effects of this thing. We've also learned that a lot of people in this country have actually just been suddenly reminded how much they like working, and how much they want to get back to working, how much they miss it. And that's a healthy thing. And if we get the all clear, there are going to be a bunch of people who are just going to just desperate to get out of the house.
Yeah.
And I don't know, given how much more in debt we've gone into, that arguments now for the Green New Deal and all that kind of thing, never mind, socialism and all that, are actually going to find a lot of purchase in people who have rediscovered their attachment to the benefits of making a paycheck. But I could be wrong.
So Jonah, that begs the question. Well, first I'll say that when you and I first got on camera, I was telling you how jealous I was that you're actually physically in an office to me at my dining room table. But it begs the question, your book, Suicide of the West, in your book, you make the argument that the bigger problem we have as a society right now is not really a policy question, but it relates to not having gratitude for everything that capitalism and free enterprise system has provided us. So just piggybacking on what you just said, are we in a better moment now in terms of gratitude because of what we've gone through?
It's an interesting way to put it. I think it creates the opportunity for it. I mean, this is one of the jobs of people, broadly speaking, in our line of work, is to every now and then just remind people how lucky they are. I just wrote this column for the LA Times, talking about how these comparisons between the Hong Kong protesters and the American protesters, and China and America having similar problems, is such nonsense. We have it, we are still incredibly fortunate to be Americans at this time, despite all of the drama and the craziness. And we are particularly fortunate to be Westerners or residents of this planet in 2020 compared to the prior, give or take, 700,000 years. And reminding people that capitalism, free markets, limited government, the rule of law, the whole Lockean package is not only the best anti-poverty program in human history, it's the only anti-poverty program in human history. People ask, why is there poverty? We know why there's poverty. Poverty was the norm of human existence for hundreds of thousands of years The only interesting and important question is, why is there wealth? And there's really only one answer to that. And it's this weird clump of ideas that came out about 300 years ago that for the first time in human history yielded increasing wealth, not just for the top of society, but for everybody. For 250,000 years, the average human being everywhere in the world lived on no more than $3 a day. Ancient Rome, ancient China, doesn't matter. And then once and only once, it starts to go like this about 300 years ago because of this idea that our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects, and the fruits of our labors belong to us. And I tend to be a long-term optimist because I think Margaret Thatcher was right about how the basic facts of life tend to be conservative, in the sense that people who want to provide for their families, people want an opportunity to live a better life or pass on a better world or a better society or just better stuff to their kids, will find a way to accept those kinds of arguments and embrace those kinds of arguments. And the demonstration effect of liberal democratic capitalism is incredibly powerful.
With that, that's a good moment for us to switch over to questions. Again, you can continue typing questions into your Q&A box on your screen, although we have a ton to sort through. So this question comes from Stanley Goldstein, longtime Manhattan Institute friend. If Trump loses in November, and this is his direct quote, will bona fide conservatives become the leaders of the GOP? And let me just, that's Stanley's question. Let me add one little piece to it. Which is, have the things that changed, are they so fundamental that, for example, a Nikki Haley couldn't get on the ticket in 2024? So can you help us understand the answer to that question?
Sure. So first of all, full disclosure, my wife worked for Nikki Haley for years. They're friends. They're close. I'm a big fan of Nikki's. I have my disagreements with her, but I don't need to get into all that here. I'll tell you, one of the most interesting disconnects in American life, at least for me, is in part because I started this new thing, the Dispatch and all that. I've met and talked with an enormous number of politicians, Republican politicians, over the last 6 months or a year. And then you go factor in the green room stuff at Fox News for the last 4 years. The number of Republican officials, prominent, including some in the administration, who are desperate to go back to Reaganism once Trump leaves the scene, is enormous. And it's much easier for me to count the number of people who actually believe the full MAGA thing. But they feel like they have to say, under Comrade Trump, we will get the greatest wheat harvest we've ever seen in public. And then in private, they say, gosh, I really want to get things back to normal. I agree with Mitt Romney and all of that kind of stuff. So there's reason to believe that at least some of these guys and gals will restore order in a post-Trump environment. One of the things that concerns me as a conservative, and I guess by default a Republican, is so many of them have lost so much credibility by not speaking up noticeably when the party went astray. And I don't think we can downplay the degree to which, the smart and dumb versions of the sort of nationalist, populist, sort of Bannonite to Hawley to, stuff that has taken root in some parts of the right, and they don't want to go back. They're celebrating the fact that the sort of classical liberal fusionist consensus is gone, and they're going to be a factor. And so I think I'm going to spend the rest of my life arguing for stuff that everyone sort of took for granted 5 years ago. And so be it. There are worse ways to spend your, the declining days of your career.
So one of the questions that we've received relates to a piece that you wrote not long ago, maybe last week, about the nationalist movement and the pandemic. And you say in that piece that it was a missed opportunity, that many of the folks who are related to the nationalist movement itself didn't act as you might presume, and that in a weird way it was a missed opportunity for them. And the question is, whether or not you see it as a good thing that the president opted to embrace federalism and free markets instead of going the other way, whether that gives you any new hope or faith.
Well, yeah, so yes and no. I am glad that Donald Trump didn't play to the stereotype that a lot of his, look, I don't think Donald Trump is Hitler. I've never thought Donald Trump was Hitler. I'm very much in the Ross Douthat camp on this. I think Donald Trump doesn't really know how to use the power of the presidency, and he wants to say he's all powerful, but he doesn't want the responsibility that comes with those claims. He wants, and so his embrace of federalism, both in the pandemic and to a certain extent in the social unrest stuff now, it's a way for him to dodge blame, right? The governors have to handle this stuff, and if they do it right, he takes credit for it, and if they do it wrong, he gets to blame them. It's a political strategy rather than a philosophical strategy. And one of the reasons why I believe that is when he says he embraces federalism one day because it's the constitutional obligation, and then the next day he says he has total authority to do whatever he wants during the pandemic. Those two things cannot be reconciled intellectually. They're just talking points. That said, yes, I would have liked if he had handled some of the pandemic stuff better. I think closing travel from China was a good thing, was a smart thing to do. I'm not sure he did it for the reasons why it was smart, but fine, he did it. You should get credit for that. But then, as far as I can tell, they basically took February off. And the only reason to close down that travel and later the travel from Europe is to buy yourself time. And instead, he said it's going to go to zero now. We don't have to worry about it. It's a media hoax that we're not doing anything, yada, yada, yada. And he blew the opportunity to actually use the time he bought himself effectively. So there are some things that I would have been happy with a little more authoritarian action, so to speak, benign authoritarian action. But I'm glad that he didn't go the Viktor Orban route. I'm glad he didn't say, during this national crisis, I assume emergency powers and we're going to go put Congress in exile and I'm not going to listen to the Supreme Court. That's a good thing. What is shocking to me is how many of the nationalist, broadly defined, intellectuals who make these sincere arguments about the need for social solidarity, the need to feel like we're all in it together, the need for the federal government to look out for everybody, the need to have a pro-life, seamless garment of life philosophy. All of a sudden, when a pandemic strikes, which should be like political manna from heaven, they instead opted to turn face masks into some sort of culture war nonsense and spout weird, sort of talk radio talking points that have no relationship to reality. This is one of the reasons for optimism for me, that the nationalists are pretty politically inept if they couldn't see the opportunity that this thing provided for them, and instead, just whiffed on it.
One of the questions coming in is from John Gordon. He wants to know, is the academic world forever lost to conservative thought, or is there hope for a swing back?
Well, forever's a long time, right? And I'm with T.S. Eliot, who, famously said, there's no such thing as a truly lost cause because there's no such thing as a truly won cause. So long as there are people fighting the good fight, hope is not lost. I think that the more likely outcome isn't that, conservative academics recapture academia. And we should be clear, there are conservatives in academia. They don't wear it on their sleeve, but I know some of them. They do good work. Robbie George is actually prominent. He does great work and stuff at Princeton, which is a serious elite school. But yet for sure they're outnumbered and they're denigrated and all of that kind of stuff. But I think the more likely scenario and way in which conservatives or libertarians can get back into that part of our culture is going to come from the fact that I think there's going to be a massive disruption of higher education in the years to come, partly because of the COVID stuff. You cannot charge what people are charging to ask kids to go on Zoom for 4 years. And
you can't unsee this.
Yeah, and just the drop off in paid tuitions that we're going to see is going to cause a whole bunch of good mid-tier and maybe even a couple elite schools to all of a sudden scramble to cover those costs, and you could see just sort of a rolling, cascading failure and that will provide a bit of an opportunity to reorient the way we do higher education in this country, which I think is long overdue.
Okay, this question is from Georgios. What policies, he says 2 to 3, but let's pick one, do you think offer, not one as the best, but one thing to discuss, offer the best affirmative vision for conservatism? I mean, his point is that just saying no constantly to the left feels like we'll run out, like it's not efficient. So give us one. It doesn't have to be your top, but just give us one example of a policy that will help give an affirmative vision for conservatism looking forward.
Sure. I feel like since this is the Manhattan Institute, I should do it all about urban zoning, but I won't. Although I think there's a lot of opportunity there. My broad answer to this is both philosophical and practical. I want to push as much power down to the most local level possible. And so I think that one of the things that we could do, and there are all sorts of reasons for it, that if you push power down to the most local level possible, these people who feel left out of our national politics won't care, because all of the politics that will matter will be closer to home. And they'll know who the powers that be are, and they'll be able to hold them accountable. So I would do stuff like, basically, even if it cost money, block grant, however you want to do it, give veterans hospitals to the states. They own them. It's no longer a federal program. Do that kind of thing wherever and anywhere you can, so that local officials will be responsible, and that local voters will know who to fire when they screw things up. And I'm one of these guys who thinks that there are very few things that the federal government should be involved in at all. I am pretty radically libertarian at the federal level. It should, it does wars, military, fights pandemics. There's a post office in the Constitution. Okay, so fine, we'll deal with that. But beyond that, send as much stuff down to the most local level possible. It will make this country a more interesting place, because different people will live differently. And that is a better route to actual happiness and human flourishing. It will empower local institutions to actually do the important things that they're supposed to do in a very de Tocquevillian way. You have to protect basic civil liberties. We fought a civil war. We amended the Constitution. We had the civil rights movement. That's done. So no, you can't have Jim Crow. But beyond that, if people in Oregon want to have stinky cheese that tastes like death without the approval of the FDA, by all means, let them have it. And I think that would be the healthiest way of reorienting this country to actually having, you still have culture war fights and all that kind of stuff, but the winners would have to look the losers in the eye, and people would actually feel like their votes and their voice mattered, because it would if their politics was oriented towards the local.
Here's a question from Chris Hutton. One of his growing concerns is the influence of alt-right or far-right tactics on college-age millennials. And how much concern do you have about the potential influence of this group in this moment in time? And I'll add to that, let's also talk, we haven't talked at all about Antifa. We should talk about that too. So how do you think about the influence of these sort of major and sort of strong strains right now?
So I don't think that they're roughly parallel. The sociologies of the two groups are very different.
For sure.
My attitude towards Antifa is crush them. I don't like Tom Cotton's give no quarter kind of thing. I don't want them shot dead in the streets or anything like that, but arrest them, put them on trial, and if found guilty, put them in jail. There's no right to destroy property and intimidate people in this country, whether you're a right winger or a left winger. It's pretty simple to me. That's not even a conservative point. That's just a civilizational point. As for the alt-right, I'm concerned about it. I'm less concerned than I was a few years ago, simply because it is emerging that, you are basically putting yourself in a permanent professional ghetto of sorts. If you align with these knobs and peckerwoods, and, I understand that Michelle Malkin, who considers herself the mother of the Groypers, and that's one of the alt-right groups that believes in Holocaust denial and all that kind of stuff, has a gig at Newsmax. Shame on Newsmax. Shame on people who, who don't want to hold her to account for all of that, but she doesn't really matter that much. And these groups don't really matter that much. I do think that conservatives need to be very clear about these things, that if you are someone who peddles in Holocaust denial, in, stupid, racist, anti-immigrant stuff, you can be for immigration restrictionism. Don't get me wrong. That's a different argument. But if you ground your arguments in sort of, these are mud people, subhuman, or that, then you should just simply be barred from any of the sort of traditional conservative institutions, conversations, and all of the rest. There's too much of the sort of Bannonist approach, which is basically a European Popular Front approach, which says no enemies on the right. And I think that is poisonous and deadly. And I think the fact that some kids are attracted to this is because they think it's subversive and all of that. So it's probably better to be mocking of it than, set your hair on fire of it, about it. I think most of these kids who come, when I speak on college campuses, they think they're incredibly clever when really they're just kind of losers and not particularly clever. And so I think contempt and mockery is probably better than saying, oh my God, the neo-Nazis are here.
So this is bringing us to the end of our interview. I want to ask one other quick question. Jonah, I didn't give you a heads up on this, but I'm sure you have a good answer. We've all, just to end on a positive note, we've all been home and not doing as much as we normally would. You read anything good that you want to recommend to our group? Any books that have moved you that you've had an opportunity to read in the past couple months?
I don't know. Let me think. I've reread a bunch of things.
Okay.
So one of the things I love, I just talked about it on a podcast. It is not for everybody, but Julian Benda's Treason of the Intellectuals, I think, is a very interesting read in this particular climate. I loved Yuval Levin's new book, Time to Build.
He was with us in January talking about it.
Yeah. And there's this book by Steve Tellez, and I can't remember the other co-author, about the never Trump or anti-Trump stuff, which was, it gave me a little stress reading because it's brought back a lot of weird times, but I think it has a lot of interesting things in there and interesting insights if you're interested in the future of conservatism or of, how to fix the parties. And then just another essay that I recently reread that I love was by John Courtney Murray called A Return to Tribalism, which had this great sort of understanding of what politics is supposed to be about. You can find it on the web by searching for the name and the title.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. To all of our viewers, thank you for taking the time to be with the Manhattan Institute. We appreciate it and hope we can be together in person soon. With that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.